Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're just going to wait for a few more participants to join us, and then we'll get started shortly. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Commissioners, I am now turning on the ability to start your video and audio.
So I see Commissioner Schwamberger got her hair cut. Very nice. Good to see you.
Geez, Chairman, you're very observant. That you're amazing.
No, you know why? It's called cataract surgery. You can see things better. And
Kathy also posted it on Facebook.
and then Commissioner Sidley, safe and sound, back from, where was it? Glasgow?
Yes. Nice trip. Happy to be home.
Welcome back.
I loved it. I would go back.
Wonderful.
Scotland is a lovely place to visit. I would definitely do it again.
Oh, good.
Maybe without the COP26 though.
Did you get to Edinburgh?
I was staying in Edinburgh. I loved it.
There you go.
It's like Hogwarts on steroids.
It's a great city.
Yeah, it is great food, charming, walkable. It was lovely and cold.
Chairman, if I may say so, just discussions like this make me really miss seeing you all in person, having more of these discussions.
Yeah, no, it's understandable. I do think, I do think we have worked together for such a long time. It feels very familial. And, I agree with you. There's much to be said for being able to do these meetings remotely. But there is that element that I think all of us enjoy because, we have the unique situation of working on a commission where I think that we have, we respect each other tremendously. I think we enjoy each other's company, and that's part of what we miss by not being able to get together. And Senator Nielsen, I see, you're not getting
on board.
You're not going to get any points from Room Raider with that background, my friend.
There's not much in the room anymore. This place is being evacuated.
No, right. Are you getting ready to make a move?
Yes, sir.
There you go. Right.
Going to be a very chaotic year.
Yeah.
Chairman.
Well, having been there myself, I know that all of the members and their staff are uniquely competent and qualified to be able to navigate that successfully.
Let's indeed hope so.
And with that, since we've now demonstrated to God knows how many people in the public realm how well we get along, let's call the Little Hoover Commission public hearing on California's recall system for November 8, 2021. And good morning. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Thank you all for joining us today. Let me introduce the other commissioners who are here with us on Zoom. We have Vice Chair Sean Varner and Commissioners David Byer, Bill Emerson, Kathy Schwamberger, and Jana Sidley. I don't think I missed anyone there. And we also have our legislative member, Senator Jim Nielsen. So with us today are the commission staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Deputy Executive Director Tamar Foster, managers Crystal Beckham and Tristan Stein, and analysts Sherry McAllister, Ashley Hurley, and Rachel Mattioli. Let me do a little bit of housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. Commissioners' audio and video will be turned on throughout the duration of the hearing. Commissioners, you may mute yourself if you wish. Please remember to unmute yourself if you want to make a comment or ask a question during the hearing. The video and audio of this hearing and our witnesses will be turned on when it is their turn to speak. Members of the public will be muted throughout the hearing. We'll have a 30-minute public comment session at the end of our hearing. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during the public comment session at the end of our session. If you'd like to make a public comment, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue, as is demonstrated on the board. Those who have joined us by phone may send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov, that's also up for your viewing, indicating you would like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you have joined so that we know who to unmute. If members of the public would like to provide written comments to the commission, they may do so via the link located on the recall study page of our website. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment throughout the duration of the hearing. As is usual at commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube channel and Facebook page. And now to the substance of today's hearing. And before I describe it, I do want to recognize the extraordinary work done by staff in the background material. Taking a look at how the other states conduct recalls, separating the constitutional requirements from the legislative ones, and as usual, providing great in-depth information for commissioners to rely upon. This is our third commission hearing examining potential reform of California's recall system. Our study on this issue has explored arguments for and against recall reform, as well as the history of the recall in California, how the recall process operates, and how the recall works in other states. In today's hearing, we'll continue our focus on whether the state system for recalling state office holders serves Californians in the best way possible. Throughout our hearing series, we've heard perspectives on potential recall reform from academics and public opinion experts. Today, we will hear testimony from current and former state elected officials responsible for administering California's election system, including recall elections. We will also hear from a member of the state legislature who has proposed reforms to California's recall system. This hearing was organized by project manager Tristan Stein, and I'd like to ask Tristan if he'd be so kind as to introduce the first witness. Welcome. Hello, Tristan.
Thank you, Chair Nava. Our first witness this morning is California's Secretary of State, Dr. Shirley Weber. Secretary Weber was sworn into office on January 29th, 2021. She is California's first Black Secretary of State and only the 5th African-American to serve as a state constitutional officer in California's 170-year history. Before her appointment, Secretary Weber served 4 terms as an Assembly member, representing California's 79th Assembly District, which includes parts of the city of San Diego, as well as several cities and communities in the San Diego region. During her tenure in the Assembly, Secretary Weber chaired the Assembly Elections and Redistricting Committee, the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Public Safety, and the Assembly Budget Subcommittee on Health. From 2019 to 2020, Secretary Weber also served as chair of the California Legislative Black Caucus. Secretary Weber attended UCLA, where she received her BA, MA, and PhD. She retired from the Department of Africana Studies at San Diego State after 40 years as a faculty member and after serving several terms as department chair. Secretary Weber, thank you so much for joining us. You may please now begin your testimony.
Well, thank you very much. And thanks to all of you for your work on this particular issue that is so extremely important. As you can imagine, being appointed Secretary of State in the end of January, 1st of February, and then being thrust into a number of very special elections, as well as eventually the recall, was really quite a challenge, not only for me, but obviously for those who had to administer the election itself. Nonetheless, the 58 counties who worked very hard for California did a remarkable job in making sure that the recall election took place without many glitches and without a host of other issues that could have happened because of the quickness in which it is done. Let me just say that from the beginning that I have assembled an advisory committee that will also be a part of the eventual recommendations that will come forward, because I have not chosen to basically at this point to take a stand for any particular piece of legislation or any particular changes that are there, although I've noticed a number of issues. I've resisted discussing changes and recommendations because of the fact we were in the midst of doing the election itself. And I did not in any way want to taint people's confidence or either influence the election as whether or not this is something we should be involved in. We were involved in a number of lawsuits, a number of issues that came forward that made it very clear to me that this is a process that has existed now for over 100 years without much change, and probably could use some work in terms of changing and being more specific about what the rules and regulations are and the methods of implementation. So with that in mind, the recall took place that cost almost $300 million, $276 million is estimated. We mailed a ballot to every Californian, approximately 58% of all of the registered voters, which is a large number now because we are almost at 90% of all eligible Californians registered to vote. There were over 13 million registered voters who actually participated in the process. And in the end, 62% of the voters voted no on the recall, with a 38% voting yes, approximately. So it took approximately 75 days for us from the time that the Lieutenant Governor called the recall election for the recall to take place. And with that in mind, and as a result, at the end of it all, we finally completed the process, and it took approximately 4 months to do the recall. California's process, as I said, is about 100 years old. It's over 100 years old. And as a result of that, we've only had 2 recall elections for governor that actually were finished and completed with regards to getting enough signatures and getting it on the ballot, just 2 in the last 100 years. But we've had in the last, obviously, 18 years, we've had those 2 elections themselves. And we see an increase in persons having an interest in election and recall elections around the state. So it gives us, it's unique in that sense that there are those of us who have actually experienced more than one recall election. And as a result, probably gives us an opportunity to look at what we've done to see whether or not this is still something that should exist in the form that it does, and has generated quite a bit of research and information concerning the recall process itself, because of the fact that we have done the only 2 in the last 18 years. As I approached this process, I began to ask some critical questions, because as we were consistently sued by a number of individuals, the question kept coming forward to me is this process fair to the public? Is it fair to our voters? Is it fair to those who are in favor of the recall that they're putting forth? Or is it fair to those who oppose? And obviously, is it fair to those who are the subject of the recall and other elected officials that are there? I am grappling with those issues now, because one of the things I've discovered is that every time I find a solution, there's also a list of problems attached to it. So there is no easy solution to this recall process that folks have come up and said, well, what about making the Lieutenant Governor the governor in case of a recall, so that we can then have transference of leadership without having to vote on a replacement, without having an opportunity to vet those individuals in a reasonable amount of time. And that sounds great up to a point, but then of course the Lieutenant Governor has issues with those. those because of the relationship it develops between the governor and the lieutenant governor. So as a result, almost every solution we come up with is someone say, well, let those who did the recall pay for the recall. Well, then that basically discourages those without a lot of resources, basically exercising their right if they choose to participate in the recall process. So when we began to ask the questions, a lot of things that come forward. Let me say a couple of things that I think we will be looking at carefully, not only in terms of taking things to the ballot, but also those regulations that govern it. From a purely administrative perspective, the county and the elected officials and myself and our offices, we think what happens, there has to be from a structural perspective, we have to ensure that we provide enough specific information that will be necessary to actually implement and administer the election itself. What does this mean? This means spelling out the rules of the recall in a sufficient enough detail so that we know that it will be implemented from year to year, if it is implemented at all, with some sense of clarity as well as consistency. In the litigation that took place after the 2003 gubernatorial recall election, the state Supreme Court, in one of its cases, Burton versus Shirley, highlighted the glaring absence of rules determining how to select replacement candidates. Both the majority and the dissent agree that the ambiguity in the election code deserve the attention of the legislature, the Constitutional Revision Commission, and the California Law Revision Commission. None of that took place. No one wanted to take it up. And so as a result, in 2021, we were faced with some of the same challenges of who gets on the ballot, what deadlines do exist, what requirements are there for them to be on the ballot. And those ambiguities continued. And it made it interesting and challenging to administer that from their perspective. It is clear that the number of candidates that get on the ballot is, but not trying to limit them, but surely having the consistency with regards to the regulations and what they needed to submit, what regulations were required, what happens if you don't submit them, all those kinds of things became extremely important. And as a result of that, any challenge that was made was almost impossible to respond to because of the short time frame that we had for the election itself. When we talk about the other issues of the threshold, should it take to actually engage in a recall? And I know you have looked at your data, and we've looked at data across the states with regards to what do other states do? What's a reasonable number? Some argue it should be the percentage based on the number of actual registered voters rather than those who had just participated in that particular election at that time. That would dramatically change the situation that was there. We found ourselves, of course, in a situation where the judge allowed more time, which made it even much more protracted in terms of this whole recall issue that was there. Some argue that our thresholds for the number of petitions or the signatures should be higher, that it should be higher than 12.5% as other states. And so we need to look at that very carefully because of the cost of the recall election. Many argue that a small percentage could basically of individuals continue to basically undermine it. We have to ask the question, do we really want a replacement ballot at the same time that you have the recall ballot? That became even more confusing for individuals. And in the end, we recognize the fact that the only thing that if the governor had been recalled, there was only one thing we were sure of, is that we would end up with a governor who did not have the majority interest of California, that they would not have the majority vote because there was no runoff. There was nothing that would basically allow us to come to a 50% plus one in terms of who would become the governor. As I pointed out, people have talked about the replacement being the lieutenant governor, and the problem that the lieutenant governor and others talk about is that the relationship between the governor and the lieutenant governor might be impaired as a result of that. We have similar things that happen in impeachment cases in the nation where the vice president becomes president, but keep in mind they're in the same party, which means we'd have to change how we select lieutenant governors in the state of California. So as we talk about these things, every example that comes across has a tendency to require additional conversation. But there are some things that that can be, and there's a concern about whether or not we should limit the number of recall elections on any particular term. We are in a position now where, and I'm seeing this in some of our cities where people, as soon as the time frame happens, it's 90 days or whatever days it is, people file for recall. Then if they don't get that one, if they don't finish those signatures, they do another recall. And so it is possible within a person's term of 4 years to have several recall elections, or at least attempts at recall. And some argue that we should not have that. We're also looking at whether or not there should be a greater time. We have a time frame now that says if it's 150 days, you can have it with the primary. But some argue that even now that this is too close, especially given the cost of an election, and may have been fined 110 years ago. But as expensive as elections are now and as complicated as they are, should we not have the option of a greater opportunity to say that it is too close to a coming election? We are now facing the same election basically 9 months from now or less in a primary that's coming forward when we just made a decision concerning a person in September. We have several who want to know, and one of the things that came up to me consistently with constituents and people in the public, they when they heard there was going to be a recall, the number one question was, what are the issues of the recall? Why are they being recalled? What did they do wrong? And I could not answer that because we don't have the standard to say you have to violate the law. You have to not have fulfill your responsibility as an elected official. You have to commit some crime or something. We don't have that. Anyone who wants to do recall can do recalls if they can get enough signatures and they have enough resources to basically pretty much pay for those signatures to be collected. So at one point we're faced with the reality of a system, recall system that obviously will be here because the public wants a recall. We know that given the research that's been done, that recalls are important in California in terms of the public. It wants it. But at the same time, there are some options that we should look at with regards to whether or not there should be actually cause for recalls. Some have talked about setting up commissions similar like this that would actually evaluate the arguments and make determinations as to whether or not there has been some violation of the oath of office or the responsibilities of the individual, rather than just the fact that you say you don't like some decision they made, you want to recall them, and you have enough money and resources to get the signatures done. So there's an ongoing challenge with that. I want to encourage everyone to continue. I know I have a short period of time to basically look at this issue. I'm hopeful that this time around, rather than what we did in 2003, we will come up with some additional things. My office, we will be looking at some of the regulations and things that we may want to propose for change. I've also, as I said, assembled an advisory committee of Democrat and Republican who will hopefully share with me their views of all of the recommendations that are coming forward, as well as additional ones that we may want to consider in order to make the recall process a smoother, fairer process that has a little bit more information and participation by the citizens themselves. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to be with you today and look forward to any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. As I was listening to you, I developed a great sense of what it must be like for your staff to try to keep up with you. Yeah, congratulations to staff that can do that. Let me turn it over to commissioners who may have some questions of our Secretary of State. Commissioner Sidley.
I mostly just want to thank you very much for your testimony and joining us here today. It was extremely enlightening, and you are asking, and your staff are asking many of the questions that we are also looking at. And so I'm warmed to understand that you are also taking a deep dive into this issue and have the concerns of the cost and also balancing what the constituency wants, which is the ability to recall if there is a path. I think we need to be very cognizant of the fact that we can't just make decisions predicated on this last recall and they were going against a guy that I liked versus a guy that I didn't like, because next time it could be the opposite of that. And so we need to look, and the state needs to look at the fundamental fairness of the recall. And I hear that in what you and your staff are looking at. And I appreciate that very much, that we won't, as the saying goes, bad facts make bad law, make bad decisions. And so I appreciate the thoughtfulness of your testimony, and hope that we can work together with what this commission comes up with and share that. And so that we all come up with something that does make sense to continue to address the needs of the state constituency, but also sort of address some of the fundamental concerns of the who comes in next, how that is done. I think that is ripe for where we need to spend our time. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And that is a major consideration in our office, is that I don't do and never have done legislation based on who's in office. In fact, I rejected legislation for that very reason, because while I might like you, I may not like the next person. So I don't want to empower you with more opportunity and then discover that I made a bad decision because the person after you is not as judicious in terms of the decisions they make. We're trying to get beyond that. And that's one of the reasons why I have asked, and eventually we will probably announce the two individuals that I'm asking to help me, that it's Democrat and Republican, basically who have good reputations in the state, to really deal into this issue. Because as I've listened to committees, I know that if they're heavily influenced by party, then we will end up with some of the rules that we've even seen in terms of changing the legislation, a little bit of changes that have occurred that were really designed to benefit one versus another. And I think that that is not good legislation, and it's not in the best interest of California. So that having been said, we hope to be able to get to some good conclusions from individuals, and then share those with you and others who are also making that, and see what we can do to influence not only just the regulations that we might be able to propose ourselves, but the changes, if there are necessary changes in the Constitution, to make it clearer as to what the requirements are and how what we have to do, because it is a game of balancing. When you're in the midst of a recall, there were a number of things we could have done, but I chose not to do any revisions major revisions, because I didn't want to be the victim of a tax that says I was manipulating the process for so-and-so versus someone else. And now that we're out of it, we need to, at this point, deal with it directly and fairly, so that we can be proud of the process that we have. And I think that's critically important. And I value what you're doing, what the legislature doing, and what others who may be doing with regards to the recall. It is extremely important.
Thank you. Commissioner Emerson, you're unmuted.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. It's a pleasure to see you again, and congratulations on your appointment. I'm curious to know, how soon do you expect your advisory committee to meet and make some recommendations?
I'm expecting them to provide me with some information by the first of the year.
First of the year.
Yes, mainly because if there are any things that need to go before the public, it would have to be done in November on the ballot. But we'll be looking at other things beyond just what's on the ballot. And so our goal is to, and we know that everybody's moving fast on this process. But the good thing is that the folks that I'm asking have some experience in working in the state, and they are familiar with the process. And I had not asked them until after the process was over, so they were not thinking in terms of all these things they could do. I didn't want them to do that. I wanted them to come in and help me to wade through these things and to come up with some reasonable recommendations that I think California would benefit from.
All right. Thank you very much.
Good to see you again too, also, Bill.
Commissioner Varner is unmuted, or Vice Chair Varner is unmuted.
Good morning, Madam Secretary, and thank you so much for your articulate testimony. I mean, I think you really framed the issues very well. My question for you is pretty simple. It's given the practical challenges of a constitutional amendment versus legislation, what can we as a commission do to help?
Well, I would, you're an important voice in this process, and I think that's what's really important. I would hope that when we get our recommendations, I'm definitely going to share it with your commission and ask you to weigh in on it and to tell us what you think. And we plan to look at your recommendations as well. And then I think we have to, if there are regulatory things that we can do without going to the ballot box, we should obviously discuss those and figure out ways in which we can do it. But also, if there are things that go to the ballot box, I hope those who can commit to the changes, and they may be minor changes, but in terms of what is required, I hope we can all get beyond our own personal discussions of, will this help me get reelected or not get reelected? Will this help me get recalled or not get recalled? And basically support it. That we look forward to hopefully sharing the information statewide through the Secretary of State's office in terms of recommendations that we believe will be helpful. And we are going to encourage those who want to participate and have conversations with us to do likewise.
Thank you. I believe Senator Nielsen has his hand raised.
Yes, Mr. Chairman and colleagues, again, Secretary of State Weber, thank you again. You're being very thorough, and I commend you for that. And in context, I will argue that we ought not be hasty about that. There's no requirement or great and grievous necessity that we complete this by the end of the year. It could be an ongoing and take some time, and we well should. Why? In context, this system has worked well for 100 years. And just that we've had a couple here fairly recently, I don't think that gives me any cause for urgent disposition that there's a crisis in California. Therefore, we must move with deliberation and thoroughness. And also, I really would argue that when we are attempting to control or modify the voters' ability, the citizens' ability to initiate a recall, it really must be done by constitution, not in any way by regulation. The regulatory process, the administrative process, is really pretty secretive. And I speak with authority because working with Leo McCarthy some 40 years ago, I helped put that into effect as a freshman legislator. And I've seen how it has developed within the agencies over the decades. And it's not to my satisfaction, really. We've had a proliferation of underground regulations and ways around eliciting citizen input in the regulatory process. And I absolutely state that agencies have consistently abused that regulatory administrative process. So we must be cautious about that too. Those are my observations, but as we proceed, again, I am not moving in any great sense of urgency and disposition that something's really broken. But we're happy to entertain a lot of suggestions, and that's what this process is set up to allow. And I thank you for that.
And I appreciate your comments. It's good to see you again. I agree up to a point. One of the challenges, as you know, that always exists is that you have to, while things are fresh on the minds of people, you have to basically address those issues. If not, as we did in 2003, people will go away and never come back. And then we'll find ourselves 18 years from now, again, with the same kind of question. What happened to the commission? Why didn't people address the issues? Because issues change so rapidly in this world in which we live right now. And I'm not saying that, we're going to throw things out and toss things out, but I think there are some things that we have discovered in the process that would be helpful if we address them. And it's not to throw out the recall or anything of that nature, but clearly I'm realistic enough to understand that if for whatever reason we cannot come to some reasonable consensus around a few things by the first of the year, then you don't do it. I mean, you don't do it. But I think if we can, as Lee said, what I've discovered is I can get beyond sometimes my own partisanism and my own narrow view of the world. And that's one of the reasons why I asked to have this advisory group to me, because I didn't want it to be a Shirley show. I wanted it to be the state of California, that we sometimes can find some better ways of doing things, of administering the process and making sure that it is fair to everyone. And so I just have a concern that what happened in 2003 with all the recommendations and all the things that came forward, that I ended up in 2021 with the same issues and the same concerns that were never addressed. And oftentimes, and I'd be very honest with this, and I'm sure the press will pick up on it, and it's not intended, is that sometimes we spend time if there had been a recall of our candidate, then we'd have certain rules we want to change, and if it's not, then there's certain things that we want to change. And oftentimes we're captured by our own point of view and our own partisanism and interest in ourselves. Not you, because you're like me, you know, we're almost at the end of this career thing. But oftentimes that drives decisions, I've discovered. And I would hope that it would not. And I would hope that this commission, as well as some others, would stop and say, okay, we've done this more. We've only done it twice. But maybe sometimes twice is too many times, or it's just enough, or it wasn't fair enough that people would have had more opportunities if we had changed some things that would have made it easier or fairer for people to participate. I don't know, but I think that there were enough issues raised, enough lawsuits filed, a host of things that came to my door that said very clearly that this thing is not that clear for what needs to happen. And I'm not sure if it's ever administered equally and fairly from election to election.
Well, thank you, Madam Secretary. I think the people of California should feel very confident and comfortable with the manner in which you are approaching this particular issue. A clearly demonstrated willingness to have conversations with all particular points of view, including different people who have different approaches. And you know, the way to resolve this is exactly what you're doing, which is you make the table bigger to make sure that there are more people at it, because it may take a little bit more time, but the more opportunities that people have to express themselves, the more confident they'll feel in the integrity of the sort of work that you are doing. And as chairman of the Little Hoover Commission, I want to express our gratitude to you for the way you're approaching this, and express our thanks to your staff for working with us and being able to pull this together. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. And we look forward to working with you as we move forward on this issue. And I appreciate the diversity of this commission and your willingness to address the issue. It is extremely important. And I look forward to the next conversation that we have. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Take care. Have a good day.
You bet. Tristan.
Thank you, Chair Nava. Our next witness this morning is former Secretary of State Bill Jones. Secretary Jones served as California's Secretary of State from 1995 to 2003. While in office, Secretary Jones implemented innovative programs to increase voter participation, place campaign contributions and spending information on the internet, and modernize paper-driven filing systems with web-based services to improve customer service. Among his other notable accomplishments was California's first ever elections summit to review state elections law to help guarantee a fraud-free voting system, establishing a special unit to investigate voter fraud, and implementing strict penalties for candidates and lobbyists who fail to meet disclosure requirements. Before his election as Secretary of State, Secretary Jones served 12 years as a legislator from Fresno in the California State Assembly, including serving as Assembly Republican leader. Secretary Jones is currently the founder and chairman of the board of Pacific Ethanol and a managing partner at J&J Farms. Secretary Jones holds a bachelor's degree in agribusiness and plant sciences from California State University, Fresno. Secretary Jones, thank you so much for joining us. You may please begin your testimony now.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I wanted to congratulate the Secretary, her appointment this last year. I'm sure she'll do a fine job, as evidenced by her testimony this morning. I also wanted to congratulate the commission who I've worked with in years past, and also my old friend, Senator Nielsen, who we served together for many years. I think this is an important topic. It's a topic that does come up periodically, just as the whole issue of the initiative process in California was revisited a number of times over the 80s and the 90s. And I think the fact that we've had a couple of recalls of statewide nature brings into focus the need for this to be looked at from time to time. However, I want to be clear that in a state like California, with the diversity of the population, but with a ever-growing one-party rule, it is important that minority parties or minorities in general point of view has a method by which they can articulate their position and get on the radar, if you will. And each party obviously and has a chance to elect candidates and to run for office. But the recall was put in place, in my opinion, for protection of minority rights. And I think for that reason, it is singularly important in a state as diverse as California. Secondly, I want to say that the past recall, number requirement to qualify, length of time to qualify, some of the elements that come into focus when you actually have a recall that only get talked about in the off years, I think was a good example this past year of a few changes that need to be made. And I think it's good the commission is taking a look at it. I would agree with Senator Nielsen that this should not be done hastily. But for example, what came to my mind as I was watching it was this problem that the registrars have when there is a lawsuit or a change right in the middle of the recall process, because as we all know, at least the secretary knows, and as the senator does, and probably many of the commissioners, it's a very tight time schedule to be able to elect a process that gives you the dates to be able to hit your your windows to be able to get the ballot done and get it out in front of the public without discriminating against anyone because of a late delivery of mail or information. So the tight time frame of the recall process does not lend itself to a lot of judicial confrontation, if you will. Consequently, you have to be very cautious how that works, because you put an inordinate burden on the registrars if you don't hit those windows on a regular basis. Another point I wanted to mention too is that I thought the recall itself, and I've watched two of them, the 03 and also this most recent one, it's to get to a point where you actually are able to qualify a recall against a sitting governor is no small feat. And the numbers required to do that are adequate. They're aggressive, and they should be aggressive. It should not be something that's done in an offhanded manner or done repetitively just out of a malicious intent. But the fact of the matter is that the numbers, I think, require an awful lot of attention, not just money, but volunteer intention to be able to qualify something like that for a statewide office holder. And I think it's a good thing to have it be an aggressive requirement, which I think the current one is. Secondly, I want to just mention too that if you notice during the recall process, when the signatures gathering was taking place, the gathering of those signatures went up quite dramatically as people's impression of the job the governor was doing came into focus, which means people pay attention to this process. It's not a cavalier one, nor is it one that is not looked upon with some seriousness by the voter. And finally, I might mention with regards to that specifically, the fact that we, and this is not a partisan statement because I think the secretary is right, nothing should be done in a manner which benefits one party over the other. This is strictly a matter of minority rights. And in the case of the current sitting governor, where you have a situation where we've been 600 days on an executive order, that's not the manner in which historically California has operated. And so you have to have some type of a alternative, some type of a process by which the voters can argue against too much overreach by the executive branch, whether it be lieutenant governor, governor, or whomever, secretary of state even. In the case of this past year, I think that's what you saw, because again, the bar is still reasonably high for someone to gather the signatures, gain the money in order to be able to get a recall measure on the ballot. With respect to having two elections where you have an election for the recall and then an election for whoever is to replace the sitting governor. I think it's a fair question that people were saying, and I noticed the secretary mentioned that, well, why would you do that? Because people don't know who the candidates are. There's not enough time to vet the candidates. And there is some merit to that. However, by the same token, it's interesting to note that you have quite a large group of people that pay the fee and want to run. And I think that's a good thing. Democracy is best when people feel like they can participate. I would argue that if you had a recall and no one wanted to participate, either as a voter, as a signature gatherer, as signing on a recall, or as running, I think that would not be good for the democracy. So the more participation, the better. So finally, I would just say in closing that, my thoughts on this are probably dated because I have not been in public life for almost 20 years now. However, I think it's important to, one, maintain the recall and protect minority rights. Two, to take into account the registrars who have to do the job, which they do an extraordinarily good job of managing that process and hitting all the deadlines for the production of the ballots for the public. Three, make sure you realize that in order to qualify against a sitting incumbent statewide office holder, there has to be some germ of problem there in order for that to happen. That doesn't happen just by accident. And finally, I would just say that I look forward to the commission's input and thoughts, and I'm sure you'll do a fine job, as commissions have done in the past, in bringing forward these different points and giving a thorough evaluation of a very important part of our history and really our contemporary government, which is the recall process.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I have on my list of commissioners, Commissioner Sidley, and I believe Senator Nielsen wishes to either make a comment or ask a question, but Commissioner Sidley, if you would.
Thank you, Chairman. So, Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for you coming and testifying today. I do have a question. It's about your position that the recall is about protecting minority rights. I don't know, that I agree with that position. I think that the recall is actually about the opportunity for citizens to decide for one reason or another that the person in office should be recalled for their activity, regardless of minority or majority rights. I don't think the recall is about an opportunity for a minority party to get a second bite at the apple if they weren't elected. And so I'm wondering where it is that you come up with the position that it's about minority rights, because I have not seen it that way. And so I think for me, it's fundamentally different. And I certainly don't think that, I think the abuse comes from if somebody wasn't elected and yet they can keep doing this recall because they just didn't get elected. I think that's where some of the abuse of what people are talking about with recall. So I'd really like to explore that with you a little bit more if I could.
All right, very good question. I appreciate your point. Well, to begin with, I don't believe, given the high bar for a recall to actually take place, that it's going to be much held as a repetitive item. I think it's very difficult to accomplish. Secondly, when I say minority rights, California, and this is opinion on my part, and I've watched it over 50 years, just as Senator Nielsen has, and we've been involved in that process. As the electoral process, the party process has changed quite dramatically. So it's not really a point of having a second bite at the apple. What it is, as whichever party is in the minority, they have a chance to run and be elected in the next election, to your point. However, what's happened in California, it has become pretty much a one-party state. And consequently, the opportunity to protect the minority from an overreach, and I use the example of 600 plus days by the current governor of executive order, is unprecedented in our history. That's never happened before. And I would argue that that's happened primarily because there has not been an opportunity for a very aggressive debate between two pretty much equivalent parties, and that's thrashed out in an election. And so the recall becomes a last opportunity for people to argue or to present their disagreement with a particular incumbent when there's only one party rule. And that's the reason I say minority. Now, if it was the other way around, and I'm sure there's probably some states where the Republicans are in that shape, but it would be true with independents too. It would be true. When I was secretary, Ross Perot was pushing his independent party, and he and I got into quite a tussle over that issue. But he had a right to have his say because, again, he was a minority view. So my point is simply, when I say minority rights, I mean whichever party happens to be out. This is a opportunity for them, if they feel, not just because they lost an election, but because a particular practice or a particular decision or whatever it might be, for that minority to express their opinion. And that was my reason for the statement.
I understand. I think that, there are personally more ways to express your dislike for decisions. There's advertising, there's campaigning versus removing someone from office because, that was duly elected. So anyway, I think I understand your position. I don't agree with it, but that's fine. That's what makes for good discussion. So thank you very much. Again, Pedro, back to you. Thank you.
Of course, thank you very much. Senator Nielsen?
Mr. Chairman, I did not have a question.
Oh, very good. Okay, just want to make sure you had the opportunity. Any other commissioners? Before, I'll give you a moment to think about that. But Mr. Secretary, I think, what we share, I think, an affection for Fresno. When I graduated from law school, so long ago, I think I still had hair. I was able to secure a position with the Fresno Employment and Training Commission, who was the CETA prime sponsor in Fresno, and spent a fair amount of time with Supervisor Sharon Levy.
Oh, yes.
Going over how it was that we might create opportunities for people who were disadvantaged, unemployed, and who needed a hand up. And I think it really helped shape my perspective, particularly as an elected, to understand that California is a big state with, we talk about microclimates. We also have, micropolitics. We have parts of the state that have orientation and perspective and views that are different from other parts of the state. It's too often identified as the coast versus the inland. I think that's too simplistic. I think there are values that people hold in different parts of California that benefit from representation of both parties. And I've never believed that the only good ideas were those that came from Democrats. I thought that the best way to govern was to ensure that you had participation from all of the people who were invested in moving the state forward. And so I always would like to harvest the best ideas from whoever it is that had them to offer. And I'm grateful for the time that I spent in Fresno. I worked there as a deputy district attorney. Before that, I worked with the Fresno Employment and Training Commission, and I think it helped round out my perspective on what people look for in terms of government.
Well,
and I see that. Go ahead, sir, please.
I appreciate that. And of course, Senator Nielsen has a history here in the Valley also. I think we would all agree that California is pretty much a candidate in an issue-driven state, regardless of political party. And that's why we've had back and forth leaders from both parties. Mm-hmm. I think the key thing is that the recall process itself is a manner in which the public can vet their opinions if their particular leaders go one way or the other way too far on particular issues. Forget the party for a moment. And I think that's why it's an important process.
Thank you. Commissioner Byer, good to see you.
Nice to see you. I apologize for not participating by video with a nice background, but I'm driving just north of Santa Barbara. I have actually three questions. The first one is we heard from a representative of county election officials about threats to registrars and other county elected officials. And I worry about that and would like comments from the former Secretary of State about that. Second, the commission, the Little Hoover Commission, previously had a report on voting, which called for use of open source software with respect to election equipment. And I'd like a comment on that. And then lastly, whether the threshold that the former Secretary of State refers to as aggressive, how to reconcile 12.5% with the fact that some municipalities, counties have either 20, 25, 30% thresholds, which seem higher and more appropriate to be using the term aggressive. So those are my three questions, and I'll go back on mute and on no video.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Well, to begin with, there's absolutely no excuse for any threats with regards to election officials. And I think that's very clear. And we would all agree on that, I would hope. Secondly, with regards to the election equipment itself, open source is a problem. The technology's changed a great deal since I was secretary. And so I don't even begin to comment on that to any great degree. However, I think it's important that the systems maintain the integrity with the Secretary of State's office, even though each of the counties have their own systems and they manage it themselves. And so it's important as we go forward with this that you get as many people to participate as possible, but you have to be very cautious, because when the integrity of the process is called into question, right or wrong, it dissuades people from participating.
I also think there was a third question, Mr. Secretary, that had to do with the 12.5% threshold.
Well, again, I think I answered that in my comments. I think the current number is sufficiently aggressive that it is not an easy standard to meet. So I appreciate the point where there are other numbers that have been used, higher percentages in certain counties. However, I would not be an advocate of increasing it for California, because as evidenced by the fact that it's only happened twice, that and being somewhat familiar with that process, that is not an easy standard to meet.
All right, terrific. Looking through my commissioners, I don't see hands raised or people unmuted. I think you've probably exhausted us, Mr. Secretary. It's a pleasure to see you. It's always great to see somebody with Fresno roots, and I want to say thank you for taking the time to share your perspective with us.
Thank you very much. Good luck to all of you.
Thank you much. All right, Tristan, I'll give you a little bit of warning. You can put down the burrito and go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Nava. Our third witness this morning is Senator Ben Allen. Senator Allen was elected in 2014 and re-elected in 2018 to represent the 26th Senate District, covering the West Side, Hollywood, and coastal South Bay communities of Los Angeles County. Senator Allen chairs the Senate's Environmental Quality Committee and co-chairs the legislature's Environmental Caucus. Senator Allen also chairs the Legislative Jewish Caucus, the legislature's Joint Committee on the Arts, and the Senate Select Committee on Aerospace and Defense. He previously served as chair of the Education Committee and chair of the Elections and Constitutional Amendments Committee. Among his efforts to reform California campaign finance and elections laws, Senator Allen authored the landmark Voters' Choice Act of 2016. He was also a leader in passing the Disclose Act and the Petition Disclose Act, which have improved disclosure of donors to political causes. Senator Allen has a BA in history from Harvard University, a master's degree in Latin American studies from the University of Cambridge, and a JD from UC Berkeley. Senator Allen, thank you for joining us. You may please begin your testimony now.
Well, thank you so much. It's so good to see everyone. And I do really want to thank Chair Nava and all the commissioners for your very thoughtful approach to so many major issues of public policy. And you're able to really do a deep dive. I've been following your discussions on this particular topic, and I just appreciate all the thoughtfulness that you're bringing to this work. You know, I come to this issue having just followed California politics since I was a kid. I remember being really struck by the recall of Governor Davis. I thought a lot about it as a younger person. And then, of course, when I had the chance to serve in the legislature, serving as chairman of the Elections and Constitutional Amendments Committee during my first term in the Senate, I got to think a lot about these issues. So I want to, I guess I wanted to just talk a little bit about an amendment that I have proposed to the Constitution, actually since Governor Brown was governor. It was something that comes out of both thinking about the situation with Davis, and then, of course, a more recent recall of our colleague, Senator Newman. And I wanted to just put that on the table as something to be discussed. So, as you know, California's recall election process permits an incumbent who receives more votes in favor of retaining office to be replaced by a challenger who garners fewer votes. That's something we've been talking about this morning. And certainly, you know, many people, Erwin Chemerinsky has written extensively about how he thinks that this violates one man, one vote concept. I don't know that I'm ready to opine on that particular constitutional question, but it does lead to a very unsatisfying situation where literally on the election day, on the recall election day, that the person who takes office will have less popular support than the person being replaced. And that just seems incredibly dissatisfying. And while I absolutely want to be respectful of minority rights, you know, ultimately elections should be about you know, what the majority wants to do, as long as there's protections of minority. And so, you know, it just seems that our current system is so backward. Of course, you know, in 2003, when Governor Schwarzenegger was elected, he actually got more votes. More people voted to put him in office than voted against the recall. So in that sense, he was, in my mind, someone who had walked into the office with more legitimacy. But we have certainly seen incidences, including in the more recent example of Senator Newman, where he got many more votes, as in many more people voted to retain him in office than voted for his replacement. And that just seems pretty anti-democratic. So I proposed several years back an amendment to eliminate this the confusing bifurcation of the yes and no first question and then the second question. And I basically modeled it after what a whole slew of other states do. And it's a mix of states. I mean, no one can claim that this list of states is a list of blue states. And we're talking about Arizona, Michigan, Nevada, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. All of these states say if you trigger a recall, if you get enough signatures to trigger a recall, we immediately have an open election where any of the candidates can run, including the incumbent, and whoever gets the most votes will end up being the person who takes the office, whether the incumbent retains his or her position in office or is replaced by somebody. But the idea is that at the very least, this would ensure that the person who has the most popular support on that recall election day will retain or take over the office. And so this is currently in the form of SCA 3. It was basically identical to a measure that I've proposed several times, including SCA 2, which we introduced back in 2019. It passed the Senate. It was never acted upon by the Assembly. I think folks were I think there's always a certain amount of I think there's reticence to tinker with the system. But now we're at a place where I think people recognize that there may be an opportunity now. There may be a reason. People may feel strongly enough to change the rules a little bit in a way that will be more democratic. I know there are lots of other ideas out there. One of them that I've heard that I think is a good idea is that the governor be simply replaced by a lieutenant governor. That's what the lieutenant governor is there for, in some respects, is to be there when the governor is not is incapacitated, if they pass away, if they get appointed to something else. So that is a good idea. some of the issues that were raised earlier is, well, what if they're of opposite parties? Well, I mean, that's our system. I don't know that that's necessarily something that bothers me too much, that at least that lieutenant governor will have been elected statewide on a regular scheduled election. I know that our current governor, while he was lieutenant governor, advocated for the lieutenant governor and governor to run together, similar to what they do in New York, similar to what they do at the presidency, right? Where the president and the vice president run together as a team, as a ticket. So we don't end up in this crazy situation where, the governor, sets foot outside of the state, goes on a trip to Washington, and let's say they have a bad relationship with the lieutenant governor. All of a sudden, that lieutenant governor is taking advantage of the governor's absence to appoint judges or do all sorts of things. So that's another thing we ought to look at. The one problem, of course, with crafting that particular type of solution is that there's only one position in our entire state governmental system, the governor, the governorship, where there is somebody waiting, somebody whose job it is to replace him or her if he or she vacates the office. And so, in the case of a senator or local elected official, an assembly member of the Board of Equalization, whatever other position, any other position, there's literally no one else sitting there waiting to take over the position. And so it would really only be helpful in the case of the governor's position, unless we wanted to create lieutenant senators for every position. I'm sure that wouldn't be something that we'd want to do. So that this is, I guess, the question I come back down to here is just asking one simple question: which candidate do you prefer? It continues to leave the choice in the hands of the electorate without creating a trapdoor for those who wish to make an end run around democracy. I'm certainly not, closed off to considering other refinements to our recall procedures, such as, as we've been discussing, adjusting the threshold of voter signatures to certify a recall petition, or requiring an official finding of corruption or malfeasance before a recall can move forward. I mean, that's an interesting discussion as well. I guess I'm sure, and Secretary Jones alluded to this. I mean, one person's malfeasance is another's. Is what someone else may consider to be a perfectly legitimate behavior. So that's obviously subjective to some extent. But I do want to I want to just put this idea forward before the Hoover Commission for you to consider. As I say, a number of other states already do this, far more than those that do it our way. There's actually literally only one other state in the country that does it our way, Colorado. And it's worked well in these other states. It's not that difficult for people to understand. The idea is simply, if you qualify for a recall, you then kick the election to a direct open election where anyone can run, including the incumbent, and you see where you go from there. So I just think in the end of the day, that provides for a simpler solution that is more democratic. At the end of the day, the person who retains or takes over the seat will have more votes. And I think it's something that's very meritorious for us to consider. I also just want to throw out there that we need to also be thinking about how whatever solution we come up with may also impact local elections. Everyone's been talking a lot about the governor's election. That's certainly on everyone's mind, given what we just went through. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of recalls that are now being proposed at the local level, school boards, city councils, et cetera. And that's something we ought to be keeping in mind as well. I know that's on your radar screen, but as you devise your recommendations, I encourage you to be thinking about the local element to this conversation as well. Thank you, and I'm happy to engage in discussion.
Thank you very much, Senator. The idea that you're proposing in terms of like a single subject is consistent with some testimony that we received from another witness who said if you're going to make changes, that they ought to be done as standalone ballot measures, so that if there are aspects of what's being offered, you don't throw the proverbial baby out with the bathwater, so that people don't have to vote yes or no on 7, 8, or 9 different changes when there might be 2 or 3 of them that they think that make perfectly good sense. So you're isolating this particular aspect of it seems to be consistent with other things that we've heard. Let me take a scan on our commissioners to see whether or not we've got any commissioners who want to ask you questions, about your educational background and where you have lunch. I mean, is it as impressive as it was? Commissioner Sidley is unmuted.
Thank you. And Senator Allen, from the Sidley family, we all say hello to you. It's good to hear you today. I'm just wondering, in your view, do you think that the state actually has the stomach for changing to a different process like that, or is it better to tinker around the edges?
Well, I think people have just gone through, I guess part of why I had struggled to get this constitutional amendment moving over the last few years is because people asked that very question, people within the legislature, and I didn't push too hard. I didn't want to be too much of a squeaky wheel on this issue. But I think that now that we've gone through this, where basically the people of the state of California voted at almost identical numbers to how they voted during the last regular election to keep the governor in office. At an enormous cost. I mean, hundreds of millions of dollars to taxpayers, and then far more money spent by special interest groups against or in favor of the governor, which kind of just further corrupts the system from my perspective. That's a whole nother conversation that we can talk about. I think people now see how problematic our system is, and the fact that you could end up replacing somebody with someone else who has less votes on that very same day is just so profoundly undemocratic. I mean, a lot of people want to say, well, there's a standalone yes or no on the recall. Well, that's true. That's absolutely true. And if the governor has to get over 50% to stay in office under the current system, I get that. But the thing is that the real world doesn't work quite that way. It's not just a matter of being able to say hypothetically whether you like the bum or not. You've got to replace the bum, whether at some point. We're not creating a power vacuum. That governor is going to be replaced by somebody else. And in the end of the day, the reason why we, had Barack Obama run against somebody and Donald Trump run against somebody and George W. Bush run against somebody when they were running for re-election it was not just a yes or no referendum on their presidency and on their administration. It was also, do I want to replace this man or woman with the other candidate or with somebody else, a real person? And so I think that the system that I'm proposing puts a dose of reality into the system by saying to voters, look, sure, you can throw out the governor, but you got to replace him or her with somebody real, like a real human flesh and blood person. And if that person gets more votes, like I believe Schwarzenegger would have over Gray Davis, to be honest, then fine, let that person take office. But if that person doesn't have enough popular support to supersede the incumbent governor's votes on recall day. Remember, we're not talking about the general election, we're talking about recall day. If that person doesn't have enough votes to supersede the incumbent, we really shouldn't be replacing the incumbent with that person who's less popular.
Would that be addressed though if we allowed the incumbent to stay on the ballot for the second question? I know you'd get a bizarre outcome. They'd want to recall him, but then we'd reelect him. And so that would be the person who gets the most votes. And or do you change how many signatures you need to even get on the ballot so that you would maybe get rid of some of the requirements or some of the lesser known individuals? I'm just trying to think through all the different things that we've heard testimony on, and sort of cut, when we get to the debate about what our recommendations are, love your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I think that it would be logically fine with me to do what you described, which would be to keep the two question system, but just allow the incumbent to run on the second ballot. That being said, I think in some respects it's more confusing to do that than to do what I'm proposing, because you would have a situation. I mean, what sort of a weird situation would it be if we were, and perhaps a little redundant ultimately, but what sort of weird position we would be in if we were to vote to recall the governor and then the governor would win on the second question. I mean, that just seems a little strange. So that's why I think that what I'm proposing is simpler. I mean, it's ultimately easier for people to understand. And I would say, just to answer your second question, I would support raising the signature threshold. Because I think the current system, as you've all discussed over the last few days, the fact that it just allows a relatively small percentage of the folks who voted for the opponent of the current governor to bring, to basically put the attack, to basically reopen the last election. It's just a vulnerable. It basically allows folks to try to do an end run around the last election, which I'm perfectly fine with doing if it really has a lot of popular support. But the idea that a third of the people who voted for the opponent can muster the signatures to basically just re-referendize the last election as much as they like, I mean, that just seems a recipe for chaos.
Yeah, and there's two sets of numbers. I mean, it's the number of signatures required to get on the ballot, for the recall just to exist, and then there's the number of signatures you need to be for the second question to be a candidate. And so it is both those sets of numbers that I think require a little scrutiny.
I think so, and I think I would also see. I think that some people would worry. Well, if you're going to allow the incumbent to be on the second question ballot with so many people on the ballot, that gives an advantage to the incumbent. Of course, let's not forget that even in 2003, when there was over 100 people on the ballot, people did consolidate around Schwarzenegger, in spite of all the people on the ballot. But I would honestly think that we should raise the thresholds a bit in both instances, both in terms of qualifying the recall and qualifying to get onto the ballot. It is. I know it just seems a little called than during a regular scheduled election.
Thank you, Senator. I have no other questions. Thank you,
So good to see you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sidley. Commissioner Emerson.
Thank you, Senator. How are you doing? Nice to see you again.
Good to see you, Bill.
Yeah. While this is not part of your proposal, I'd like to get your thoughts on the issue where the lieutenant governor would take the position of a recalled governor, and then how we look at that whole replacement of the lieutenant governor. Would we look at it similar to the situation where Alex Padilla and Shirley Weber were appointed and approved by the legislature to fill that position? Just any thoughts you have on that succession?
Yeah, I think I suppose the best thing you do is you ultimately, right, you get the new governor who was the former lieutenant governor would appoint his or her lieutenant governor, just like we saw when President Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to replace Spiro Agnew. Obviously it would be very important to have it approved by the Senate at the very least, that we're both houses of the legislature. I think that's how we do it. Both houses of the legislature, actually. I suppose I feel comfortable with that ultimately, because in the end of the day, the lieutenant governor, for better or for worse, was elected by the people of the state of California. They stood on a regular scheduled ballot, and they were voted for by the people. And so that feels, there's a legitimacy there that I feel comfortable with. The one issue, as I repeat, is just, what do you do for every other position?
Right.
And that's something to consider.
Good. Well, thank you. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Commissioner.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Let me take a look. Are there any other commissioners? Commissioner Varner, thank you. Vice Chair Varner.
Thank you. Good morning, Senator Allen.
Good to see you.
One of the things that that you touched upon, which is one of my concerns about the recall process, is the cost and how special interests participate, and that becomes, I hate to say it this way, but it can become kind of a circus in some respects. And in this recall election, the costs were extraordinary, and it was, it's within a year of the next election process for the governor. Do you have any thoughts on the timing of the election? And then also, and I don't know, this is probably a bigger discussion of how we address the costs and associated with that. And then another question that's somewhat related is, I guess if you had the lieutenant governor as the potential replacement, then that could minimize the amount of effort that goes into the recall election, knowing that that person would be. I think it lends some credibility to. It has to be a fairly significant issue to generate a recall election, and the other alternative would possibly have a second election. Well, once you call the question, then have a second election for governor, but that would obviously have issues with cost as well.
No, so the costs are enormous. I mean, really, the cost of the taxpayer, the cost, and then as I say, I don't think we should discount the cost of running for election and the impact that has on the integrity of our political system too. It's one of the reasons why I am very in transparency efforts, because there's such a pernicious interplay between money and political activity. So I think you're right. I think having two rounds of elections, once again, expensive. I also think it creates a lame duck situation. I guess I keep coming back to in my mind, I keep coming back to this whole situation, which really speaks to why we're doing this in the first place. Let's not forget that these people are subject to regular election processes. They're also subject to the courts. If anybody engages in any type of illegality, governors can and have been hauled before courts and kicked out of office. I mean, I remember, Jim McGreevey in New Jersey not too long ago when I was a little younger, who really ran into terrible trouble and ultimately had to resign. We have the courts. We have an impeachment process in the legislature as well. So there are other ways of holding a governor accountable. I'm not suggesting getting rid of the recall, by the way, but it's not as though this is the only mechanism for forcing some accountability on this powerful elected official. So I think that people need to be reminded of that as well. This is not the only way, and if someone is really engaging in some sort of egregious behavior, there are other ways of holding that politician accountable as well.
Thank you. Looking through, going once, going twice. Any other commissioners who wish to speak? I don't see raised hands. Senator Allen, okay.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Thanks for your very thoughtful deep dive into this tough topic.
Thank you, sir. Let me turn this over now to Ethan. I believe we may be ready for public comment.
I believe so, Mr. Chairman. So members of the public who wish to make comment may indicate to us that they wish to do so either by using the raised hand function. If you have joined the meeting by Zoom, that's the best way to do it. Use the raised hand function in Zoom. Or if you have phoned in, as you can see on your screen, send an email to littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. Again, that address is on the screen, littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. Include your name and the phone number from which you are calling, which is important so the staff knows who to unmute when you are called on. If you wish to make public comment, the commissioners will be able to hear you but not to see you. And in accordance with the commission's traditional policy, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per commenter. So please limit your comments to 3 minutes. And with that, I'll ask staff if we have anyone who has indicated a desire to make public comments.
We do have a desire. We're starting off with Mike Feinstein. Mike, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Great, thank you. Mike Feinstein, former Santa Monica mayor, city council member, co-founder of the Green Party of California. I believe you should slightly adjust your threshold, but not for the reasons most people are saying. We shouldn't use the bad facts of the perfect storm of the COVID frustration in a 100-year pandemic and the extension that the judge gave. What we should do is make it a percentage of the overall registered voters. Why? Because the uncompelling black and white lack of nuance choices that come out of top 2 general elections mean that there's a lack of voter interest and a reason to turn out because those races are uncompetitive. So it shouldn't be based upon that. And we have to remember that voters' choice is greatly limited by top two, and 700,000 non-Republicans signed the last recall petition. In terms of getting the replacement winner to have more votes, the election should be on a separate day by ranked choice voting. We already have lame duck people who lose in the general election and are replaced several months later. And we have people who lose in primary elections and are replaced many, many months later. By having a separate election, you can, by ranked choice voting, you have a majority winner, but you also have a better candidate field because the current system promotes extorting out candidates from your own party. And that's what Schwarzenegger did with fellow Republicans back in 2003. The current system is confusing about whether your first vote cancels out your second vote. It won't be confusing if we go to ranked choice voting. If the ballot language says we are promising voters that the winner of the replacement election will be a majority winner. What happens then in the replacement election? The Secretary of State, Dr. Weber, can make the candidate statement be de minimis under Prop 34. It is a voters' rights issue to have more information. The legislature also needs to find a way to get the California channel back and provide free TV time for everybody who's on the ballot, again, in order to make it easier for voters. We should not be, as the Democrats have tried to do, to quote, thin the field by adding this tax form requirement. I said this on your last call. Don't blame us, the voters and potential candidates, for not holding public hearings when top two went on the ballot. And now suddenly, you know, we're used to having too many candidates in those elections and in recalls. So the other thing with the Josh Newman, his district is 50-50. The answer is proportional representation and multiple representatives for one district, not getting away with recall laws because half the people don't feel represented. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Mike. Next, we're going to move on to CT Weber. CT, I'm turning on your ability to talk.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. My name is CT Weber. I'm the legislative liaison for Peace and Freedom Party of California. Just want to make a few comments. One is that many people say that we represent poor people in California. And in a way, it's true because poor people are left out of many of the decision-making processes that take place in the state. And so we kind of feel that we ought to open the system up more, not keep it more restrictive. So I think I would like to start by saying that we understand that recalls are expensive. We don't think that means that you should make it more difficult. Rich people are always going to participate no matter what the cost because they have the money and the resources. Poor people can't. So money is an issue. So recalls are expensive, and therefore, unlike the previous caller, I think that they should be handled in one election. I do agree, though, that ranked choice voting is the way to go. And by ranked choice voting, you're going to guarantee that whatever candidate comes out of this election will have a majority. The problem with just having plurality voting and you have all the candidates on the ballot is that the person who wins may have less votes than the other candidates in the race. So by ranked choice voting, you guarantee that that person is going to have a majority on the final count of all those people that are voting. I really like the things that former Secretary of State Bill Jones and Nielsen was talking about when they were talking about our diverse population in California and the need for citizen input. The question I had for Shirley Weber was, how do we participate? I've tried to reach her office several times and been unable to. So one thing that I guess I'd like to leave you with is that there seems to be a lack of any consideration of ranked choice voting, even though it's been mentioned by one of your lead witnesses one time. And I think that that's something that you should consider. It's now taking place in many states, including they just had the elections in New York City for mayor and so forth. The other candidates, the whole state of Maine is using ranked choice voting. So I think it's something that we can use. Thank you very much.
Thank you, CT. We do not have any additional requests for public comment on Zoom or on email.
Thank you very much, Ashley. So, Mr. Chairman, I think then we have completed our agenda for today. If I may, I'll just take a moment to remind the commissioners about the next meetings before we adjourn. Tomorrow at noon, the commission will hold a webinar. This is the second time we have held a webinar. This one will focus on the report on the pandemic and childhood mental health. Vice Chairman Varner and Commissioner Byer will present about the report, and we will also hear comments from other stakeholders as well. We have served a Bagley-Keene notice in case 6 of you call in to join that webinar, and we would encourage you to do so. However, there will be no commission business transacted, no taking of testimony. So it's really up to each of you, but we have served a Bagley-Keene notice. So happy if you wish to call in. That is tomorrow at noon. And then the next business meeting of the commission will be November 18th. I would highlight for commissioners that is at an unusual time, 1 p.m. We hope to have the report on post and police training go before the full commission for approval, and there'll be some other business as well. And obviously we'll be providing additional information before that meeting. So November 18th at 1 p.m. is the next business meeting. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I believe we have completed our agenda for today.
Great. Thank you very much. Let me express my gratitude to the commissioners. I will tell you, one time I was asked by an appointing authority, they were considering someone for commission appointment. And they said, well, as the chair, what do you want? What are you looking for? And I said, give me somebody who shows up and reads. The rest of it works out perfectly well. And that's exactly the kind of commissioners we have and beyond. I'm very, very grateful to have the opportunity to continue to work with all of you. Great to see all of you, and wish you all well. Thanks for your participation. And thanks to staff.
Thank you.